Ahí están, ahí tienen que anotarse, chiquillos. Buenos días, qué gusto de verlo. Bueno, ya, y ahí van pasando, ya, van pasando.
Estoy seguro que hay unas personas que no son del curso.
Pero está muy bueno, acá está Esperanza. Oye,
Hola.
¿tú conoces a Esperanza?
Sí, de la hija
mi
del
amigo
Pepe.
Qué bueno que lo conoces. Ya.
Su persona de audio me sacó el audio a cabina, no están escuchando nada. La persona de audio hizo algo que me cortó el audio. ¿Me escuchan? Probando, probando. Claro, se escucha por parlante, probando, pero acá debería.
¿Sabes? ¿Esto?
Probando.
¿No? ¿Tampoco?
Sí, ya escucha. Probando, probando. Está saliendo por parlante y parece que hubo zoom, pero no por. Probando, probando. Probando. Ahí me escucho los zoom. Déjelo de ver. Permiso. ¿Escuchan? ¿Nada?
Y el intérprete me va a decir, vos, sí, sí.
¿Ahora escuchan ellos? Se escucha con eco.
Aquí estamos acá adentro.
Ah, ok, ya.
Y tenía mucho. Los tres. Sí. Ah. Ahora yo creo que te salió el efecto. Y estáis escuchando porque estáis en Auxiliar 2. Este es el. Para que ellos se escuchen.
Pues ya los de espera se va a escuchar.
Sí,
Ya.
pero ¿tú puedes grabar ahora? ¿A dónde están ustedes?
Afuera.
Voy a grabar.
Ahora sí. Ahora sí.
¿Habla entonces?
Sí, a ver. Aló, probando. Sí, me parece que quedó bien.
1, 3. 1, 3, sí.
Okay, so I think we can start.
Sí.
Yes. ¿Sí? ¿Ahí están todos? Sí. ¿Usted cuando usted diga?
Voy a verlo.
Yeah. Yes, I will let you know. And if not, if you like, I can be there and I can do that on my own, and then you don't have to be worried about that. Okay, then come. Look, your is here, yeah? Here, huh? Ahí, and now I will briefly, and then when you need, you have to share from here, and then take it here, and then share it here. Huh? And then it will be here, and at the same time, it will be in Zoom, okay?
That's good. So then all I will have to do is go like this to advance? No?
No, and then here, we put it like this.
All I need is a button to.
That's all. And there you, with this, you click here, 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 you know? And then, okay, for example, now we are, I will, for a moment, not share anymore, okay? But this I can do for you briefly, no problem. We go here, okay? We share, we open.
Just
And
leave it
then-
for sharing all the time, and then I can work on that.
And then here, look here, you put, this is presentation mode. One moment, because they need como to, ahí, y ahí, mira, look, one, ahí, with the roll, connect, or with this, mira,
No, like this.
Like
just
this.
leave it. Okay.
when in the, claro, esta o esta the same, ¿ya? Esa behind and esa, o sea, backward
I'll
and
just
forward.
do that. I'll leave it like that.
Leave it like that, okay. But now I need to, for a moment,
Do whatever you want.
yes. But when you start, we will do it like what we already did now,
Okay.
yeah?
Okay.
Because I need to say hello,
Okay,
how are
yes,
you?
yes.
And then at the beginning to introduce you, and
Okay.
then we put your presentation in the Zoom.
Okay, I'll let
Yes.
you do it. Okay. Do you want me to sit up there now, or should I wait?
A moment, because they are still with the difficulties with translation, but
Okay.
everything is going to be in a moment, and then we're ready,
Okay.
then we sit down.
Okay.
Paciencia, pero hola, ¿cómo está? Qué gusto de saludarlo. It's from Brazil, PhD Joao Cardoso. Yes, it's an honor that you came and be with us. Thank you. Yes. Later, we are going to share a coffee, so if you like with Ramon and with us to come, it's up to you.
Sounds good.
Okay, right. Ya. Entonces, ¿estaría listo ya? ¿Está listo?
El profesor.
Hasta para el profesor.
Sí,
¿Dónde
para-
se lo
para
tiene
que-
que poner?
¿En el oído?
¿En el oído?
¿En
Ya.
el oído?
Professor, for you, for your ear, cuando hablen en castellano,
Only
when the
speaking
people
in
Spanish, you can also for you, okay? Ya, great, listo. ¿Estamos listos entonces, no es, señor? Marcial, ya, listo. Entonces, si no les importa, yo creo que por el calor, chiquillos, voy a dejar un poquito junto, pero si hay aquí. Está lo más heladito que pueda la sala, si me la pudiera poner como aire. No se puede más, pero es lo máximo que puedo. A Jaime, que me ayude un poquito con eso, ¿ya? Bueno. Entonces, bienvenidos todos quienes están presentes esta mañana. Voy a hacer pasar al profesor, junto al director del Departamento de Derecho Internacional, al profesor Luis Valentín Ferrada y el profesor Tim Bacon, van a compartir hoy día conmigo el escenario, y una vez que estemos ahí, vamos a comenzar ya oficialmente la conferencia, ¿ok? Eso pues, muchas gracias. Entonces, asiento. You can, yes, please use that one and me here. Have a seat. Sorry, it's a little bit small, but with the patience and creativity, we will do our best. Okay, so yeah, now I think they can turn on the presentation for YouTube. And welcome everybody. Thank you for being here. It's a lot of today's students and colleagues and academics that are with us. So I thank you very much for all of you, your presence. And we are today starting the conference of called Creating a New Constitutional Structure for a Democracy. And in this occasion, we have the honor to receive with us Professor Tim Bacon, that is at my right side, and Professor Luis Valentín Ferrada at my left side at the moment. Both of yes. So I would like to introduce today our professor that came specially from United States, and also I thank, of course, Fulbright, who made possible this conference and the trip of professor that has been with us these 2 weeks. And I also, before I introduce his CV, I would like to say thank you for both of you, and also to the University of Chile and the School of Law and Communications and everybody who made possible this event. Having said so, briefly, I would like, before the professor will start his conference, say that Professor Tim Bacon is professor of law at the U.S. Military Academy, West Point, and previously he had practiced law in New York City in civil litigation at law firms and as a prosecutor in Brooklyn. He also has been a visiting professor at Ural State Law University in Russia and a visiting scholar at Columbia University, the University of Sydney, the Australian National University, and the University of Cambridge. He mentioned here a book. He has several books, I could say, several articles and presentation. I would say more than maybe 30 articles and around 10 books. He, for example, write about the cost of loyalty, discusses the role of the military in a democratic society. And he also, as he already said, practiced law in Brooklyn, in New York, and his books, the last one in 2022, The Plea of Innocence, Finding Truth in a Justice System. Also, for example, another highlight of his books, Criminal Justice and the 2004 Elections, and so on. So he's here. I have 10 pages of your CV, Professor. So we are very delighted to have you here this morning at our School of Law, and with a lot of students that study at the moment international law. So thank you very much. I welcome you. And later I will present Professor Luis Ferrara, who will comment all the ideas that Professor Tim Bacon will share with us today. So thank you again, and please go ahead. The floor is yours. Yes. And I will do this. Yes, and then it's ready.
To advance.
To advance, you just this, or here, look, this. Better with this roll, you know, and like this. And both sides.
Professor Moore, thank you very much. And thank you to the University of Chile School of Law and to the Fulbright Commission in the State Department of the United States for inviting me here today. I want to thank Professor Ferrara also for being willing to serve as a commentator today. I appreciate it very much. Thank you. And especially my thanks to Professor Moore, who has facilitated my trip to Chile and has ensured that everything has gone swimmingly well. And I have the greatest appreciation and thanks for that. What I'd like to talk about today is creating, of course, a new concept, talking a little bit about how a military, which is one of my areas of interest, relates to operating in a democratic society. What I'd like to focus on first is a brief provision in the draft Chilean Constitution of 2022 that relates to the military. It's just one section, and it talks about the following: the armed forces are professional, obedient, and non-deliberative institutions. And from that, I'll try to make some generalized inferences, and maybe inferences is too strong a word, but certainly make some general comments about how a military can or even should operate in a democratic society. To do that, I'll try to provide some comparison with the United States Constitution and how it, the US Constitution, deals with regulating the military in that society.
Yes. A little bit and then.
To do that, I just want to mention 4 wars in which the United States was involved in. They're significant because today the United States government, the federal government, devotes over 20% of its domestic funding to the military. It is a large institution, not only in foreign policy, but also in domestic policy. And we've seen the military in the Korean War in 1950, in the Vietnam War for a longer period of time. And we saw that the United States attacked Iraq in 2003 because allegedly Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction. It turns out that it did not. In addition, in 2001, it attacked Afghanistan and was there until 2021, a very long time for any foreign country to be in any other area other than its own domestic domain when protecting itself. Regardless of what one thinks of those particular wars and whether they were meritorious wars, the result was the wars were very costly to the United States in terms of the number of soldiers lost, 100,000, and the amount of resources that were used in those wars. And that 100,000 soldiers lost by the United States does not include the approximately 3 million to 6 million people who were killed in the wars in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq. This is an example of the wars in Afghanistan, and I wanted to show this photo to illustrate a couple of things. One thing interesting about this is when militaries operate in other countries, they have to do so under their own constitutions. They have to be there with the authority of their own constitutions. In this particular photo, what you might find interesting is what these two security guards are holding. And this is what happens in a society when a military takes over. It was the US military taking over Afghanistan in 2001. There really isn't a semblance of policing on a civilian level. Policing is done by the military. What's interesting here is that the security officers are holding two photographs. During the reign of the Taliban did not permit people to look into mirrors, and they did not permit the people to take photographs of themselves. I took these photographs the previous day of these security officers and gave them the photographs the next day, and it was, they said, one of the gifts that they really appreciated the most from the Americans being there. And it turns out that they probably didn't appreciate much more of the Americans being there during those 20 years in Afghanistan. And you can see this is 2007. Remember, the United States invaded Afghanistan in 2001, but this is 2007, and the main airport in Kabul, if you can see in the photograph, is still dominated by military aircraft, helicopters. And that is to say, once a military enters a country, it's very difficult. And I don't just mean a foreign military, but a domestic military as well, civilly and in a military way. It's very difficult to extract the military from society, even if we want to regulate it a little bit more. By way of contrast, this is the US Constitution. I know this is difficult to read. I recognize that. I'm going to make it a little bit clearer. But this is essentially all the authorities that the legislature, the US Congress, has to regulate and make laws in the United States. In 7 of the 17 main provisions of regulation that the US Congress possesses, 7 of them are regulations concerning the military. That's an indication, 7 of 17 specific provisions of how much in 1789 the drafters of the US Constitution not only feared the military, but wanted to regulate the military. In essence, these are the only authorities in the US Constitution given to the US Congress. Borrowing money, taxation, regulating commerce, immigration, and the like. They're fairly pedestrian kinds of governmental functions. They're not anything extraordinary, except to the extent that they help the government function well. That is to say, the United States Constitution is a negative constitution. It says that the US government may not do certain things to us. Yet, the American Constitution does not say that the government must give anything to us. There's only one exception to that, and that is, and I can ask it with this question. Under the US Constitution, what must our government give us, at least on the federal level? And it turns out that there's only one material thing that it must provide, and that material thing is the right to a lawyer, a free lawyer, if we're charged with a crime in the United States. Other than that, there's no right to housing, to education, to food, to a welfare system, to a pension system. There's not even a right to police protection under the United States Constitution. All of that, any of those rights have to be enacted by Congress or by lower level governments within the states and within the individual cities. These are the 7 provisions in the US Constitution that regulate the military. As you can see, they determine very extensively what the military can and cannot do. And in essence, there's almost nothing that the military can do without the approval of Congress. And in another article, this is Article 1 of the US Constitution, there are 7 original articles. In the second article, and this is like the draft Chilean Constitution as well, the commander-in-chief of the military of the army is the president. Here are the questions that I would pose for Chileans, because I've seen these questions asked in the United States, and I can't say that we have finally or adequately decided what we want our military to be. We have an idea what we want our military to be, but I'm not sure. I've asked the question. Professor Morey mentioned a book that I had written, The Cost of Loyalty. Did our military really accomplish what we wanted it to accomplish? We've had 4 major wars since World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq. And all of those countries today are not very favorable to United States interests. Therefore, I think it's fair to ask the question, what do you want your army to be in regard to its foreign policy and its foreign affairs? What do you envision it to do? In addition, there are domestic issues with the Army. And here are some of the domestic issues that I thought might be of interest to you. Does the Army coordinate, or should it coordinate with local police? Is it involved in border security? To what extent should it be involved in handling criminal gangs? And to what extent should the Army be involved in stopping multinational narcotics trafficking? Here's an illustration that I think will be interesting to you by virtue of a couple of photographs. This is the Argentine military operating as peacekeepers for the United Nations. This is the Israeli army acting within Israel. It has a presence militarily beyond just policing within the country of Israel. This is interesting because it will provide a comparison between policing in Mexico and policing in the United States. Joaquin Guzman, known as El Chapo, was a notorious drug dealer, according to the United States government, and sent a lot of drugs into the United States. He was finally captured in Mexico by the Mexican army, and then he was transported to the United States. You can see the different levels of security necessary and the different levels of how an army operates by looking at this photo with the Mexican army bringing in Guzman, or being prepared to take him to the United States to be prosecuted. And this second photo, when he was brought to the United States and he was turned over to civilian police, civilian authorities. On the left is a civilian agent for the Department of Homeland Security. And on the right is a civilian agent for the Drug Enforcement Administration. Those are both federal agencies in the United States. But you can see that the United States is not a country that's comfortable, like Mexico, with its army operating within its domestic borders. The US Army does not operate on the border either. Now, there are instances when there are emergencies, when only the Army or only the military, only the armed forces can bring enough people and organization to bear to help us when we need help, such as with regard to national emergencies, or if there were a severe issue on the border. But I would say for the most part, and actually it's not even for the most part, it is almost absolutely, the military is not even involved. It's prohibited from becoming involved in border operations in the United States. It's just the nature of the United States that goes back to 1789. Our country has been unwilling to give the military much latitude to operate in a combat way, in uniforms within the United States. This is a general, on the other hand, in 2023, who is operating as essentially the police in the country of Dubai. And this leads to, and we'll turn over in a few slides commentary to Professor Ferrara, non-combat issues concerning the Army. And some of these, I don't know if they can be answered in a constitution. They can certainly be posed to raise issues that will lead you to draft provisions or not draft provisions in your constitution with regard to the military. But here are some of the non-combat issues. Should the Army be separate from civilian society? One very important thing to remember is also, to what extent do you want your military to have its own legal system? The United States military has its own legal system. Or do you want your military to be, for example, if soldiers do something allegedly that's illegal, to be prosecuted in a civilian court? This was the book that I wrote about trying to determine the nature of the military in a civilian society, the cost of loyalty. Here are some provisions in the draft Chilean Constitution of 2022 that I wanted to raise. This is fairly normal, I think, for democracies. Article 303 contains in subsection 4, the armed forces and police must strictly comply with the orders of the head of state of emergency in charge. You may very well want that, but by way of contrast, I can say that the president doesn't have, our president of the United States doesn't have any control over local police. Whether there's a national disturbance or a lesser disturbance, all local police departments are controlled by either cities or the states. There is no control by the president of the police force. Here's another provision from the draft constitution. The president of the republic will choose from among the most senior general officers. They will last 4 years in their functions. I'm not sure whether that's common in Chile or not, or whether this is something that would restrict the president to truly the 5 most senior officers, which would mean that the military would, in some respect, control who becomes the leaders of the military by the rate at which they promote officers into the 5 most senior positions. And this again is Article 299, and my focus is on Section 3. The armed forces, they meaning the armed forces, are professional, hierarchical, disciplined, obedient, and non-deliberative institutions. A large portion of my research over the last years has concerned, what do we want from the people who are the leading officers in our military? It'd be like asking, what do we want from our leaders, whether they're leaders from a law school or whether they're leaders in civilian government or leaders within the military? Do you want them to be professional, hierarchical, disciplined, obedient, and non-deliberative institutions? I suppose to some extent, the answer to that is yes, you do want that. My question with regard to the Chilean constitution and the military is, it appears that this is designed to ensure that the Chilean military will always fall under the command of the president. That's a good idea. I don't know of any better way to do it than that. But when I went back and showed you at the beginning the wars that the United States was in, I showed one from the Vietnam War, one slide from the Vietnam War, which lasted about 10 years. It was really more than 10 years. The US was there that period of time. And over the period of time, we now know that during the wars, the military generals were not telling the truth about the progress of the United States in the wars. They were saying that the wars could be won, when in fact, they believed the wars could not be won. They were saying, and here's an example, that there was a crossover point at which they could win the war, at which the generals could win the wars. The crossover point was 300,000 North Vietnamese soldiers. This is a bit of history. The United States, France was in the United States, France was in Vietnam before the United States was. Then the United States entered Vietnam strongly in 1962 and 63 under President Kennedy, and then in 1964. The generals said, mainly General Westmoreland, that there was a crossover point. This meant that he believed the US military forces could kill enough North Vietnamese soldiers to reduce the number of North Vietnamese soldiers below 300,000. If the generals believed they reduced that number below 300,000, which they said they could, then they said we could win the war. But in fact, it turns out that the number of North Vietnamese soldiers continued to perpetuate. And there were not only soldiers, but there were also civilians who acted on behalf of the North Vietnamese, was at 450,000. The US military never came close to eliminating enough soldiers to reach the crossover point and to win the war. But they didn't tell us that. The Army Chief of Staff was a general named Harold Johnson, a revered soldier in his time, but he was the Chief of Staff of the Army from 1964 to 1968. Neither General Johnson nor any other general ever spoke up and said the wars could not be won, even though they believed the wars could not be won. And this is what he said when he was approaching his death many, many years later. In essence, he said, I wanted to go into the president's office and leave him my 4 stars, but I didn't do that. And I wanted to go out and speak to the American public and tell them that the war could not be won, but I didn't do that. And I'll go to my grave with that lack of moral courage on my back. I contrasted that with what's happening in Israel today in 2023. The Israeli civilian government is proposing to limit the judiciary. It wants to pass a law that would allow the civilian government to essentially eliminate a decision by the Israeli Supreme Court by a vote of 50%. The military was very involved in that. And the military chief of staff, Yoav Gallant, stated, this is in March 26th of 2023, just last month, that he disagrees with this policy. It was unfortunate for him to disagree, I suppose, but unlike General Johnson in the 1960s, there was something in Israeli culture in the Israeli army that allowed him to speak up. And he said, I don't think it's a good idea to take away the independence of the judiciary. He was fired by Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, but nonetheless, he made the point, and the result was a delay in the elimination of judicial independence. I don't know whether that delay will continue or not. Finally, as I recommended in my book, and I think these are things worthy of consideration, and they are three final points that I would like to consider. My conclusions have been, and I can't decide what's best for Chile, only you can decide that. My main points with regard to the American military that I'm fairly sure about, and there's much disagreement about whether my points are valid and they should be adopted or not, is that the American military should be more integrated into American society, not more separate. Second, my position is that American general officers, American generals, should have an obligation to speak up when they believe a war cannot be won or a war cannot be fought. They should have an obligation to speak. Some people will say that there shouldn't be such an obligation because it's the burden of soldiers to be quiet, to be non-deliberative. And again, I don't know how non-deliberative might be interpreted by the Constitutional Tribunal of Chile, but I don't believe that American generals should be non-deliberative. In the law of war or humanitarian law, whatever one wants to call it, in the law of war, which is usually referred to in the United States, a soldier has an obligation not to follow an order if he or she knows the order is unlawful, such as an order to kill a prisoner of war. I don't see why generals should not have an obligation to speak up when they believe that a war should not be fought or cannot be won. And with that, I'll leave this to Professor Rada for any comments that he might graciously make.
Thank you very much for your excellent presentation, Professor Tim Bacon. And I will turn briefly to Spanish, knowing that we have the translation to introduce Professor Ferrara. Entonces, nuevamente, bueno, estamos muy contentos de estar esta mañana aquí. Ambos organizadores, Fulbright y el Departamento de Derecho Internacional de la Facultad de Derecho de la Universidad de Chile, estamos conversando sobre la visión de la estructura de la nueva Constitución a la luz de la experiencia norteamericana y su sistema jurídico vigente, que es lo que ha conversado esta mañana el profesor Tim Bacon, y entonces el profesor Luis Valentín Ferrada, quien ha tenido también la gentileza de acompañarnos hoy y de compartir con nosotros los comentarios a la ponencia del profesor. Voy a entonces presentarlo. El profesor actualmente es el director del Departamento de Derecho Internacional de nuestra facultad, y el profesor también tiene un largo currículum y tiene bastantes también actividades. Entonces voy a mencionar las más relevantes a lo que se refiere a nuestro, abogado y licenciado en Ciencias Jurídicas por la Universidad de los Andes y doctor en Derecho por la Universidad de Chile. Y bueno, también, además de su gran experiencia en distintas, fue profesor de Historia Militar en la Escuela Militar Bernardo Higgins, también es profesor actualmente de Derecho Internacional, estudió también en la Universidad Autónoma de Madrid, donde es profesor visitante, y también es experto en temas antárticos, en los cuales también tiene un grupo de excelentes ayudantes que participan con él en diversas actividades. Así que muy amable, director, y ahora the floor is yours. Entonces, todo suyo. Muchas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, profesora Moure. Muchas gracias, profesor Bacon, por su muy completa y interesante conferencia. La verdad es que yo venía preparado para hablar en inglés, pero me imagino que Cervantes se alegrará que en la Universidad de Chile hablemos en castellano. Yo creo que eso iba a hacer un comentario sobre eso, pero me ahorraré el comentario y sencillamente daré mis comentarios en castellano. Lo primero que hay que tener en cuenta, y yo creo que el profesor Baker lo hizo notar de alguna manera, es que las normas que cada país requiere, y en especial las normas constitucionales que cada país requiere, no pueden sino que estar enraizadas en su propia historia. Y si bien las constituciones de los distintos países tienen muchos parecidos y hay como la parte orgánica y la parte dogmática y hay ciertas cosas que los profesores de Derecho Constitucional llevan como algo así como una teoría general del derecho constitucional. El derecho constitucional, sin duda alguna, para que sea exitoso, para que tenga sentido, esto lo decía ya Andrés Bello cuando trabajó en nuestro Código Civil, él decía, mire, lo que hay que codificar, hay que seguir el modelo francés de codificación, pero lo que materialmente hay que codificar son las normas que se aplican en Chile, porque si no, no tiene ningún sentido. Entonces, lo primero que hay que decir es que me parece que nuestra experiencia constitucional es una experiencia que uno no puede lanzarse al vacío y pretender escribir todo desde una página en blanco, como se trató el año 22, pero tampoco puede desarraigarse, o lo mismo dicho de otra manera, no puede desarraigarse de nuestra historia constitucional. Habiendo dicho lo anterior, no es menos cierto que el estudio del derecho comparado, incluido el derecho constitucional comparado, es sin duda alguna uno de los elementos más importantes que uno tiene, que cualquier jurista, que ustedes como estudiantes de derecho tienen, para ver otras realidades, sobre todo para ver cómo han funcionado otras realidades. Y es desde esta perspectiva que me parece que el ejemplo norteamericano, estadounidense, el ejemplo estadounidense, respecto a cómo deben relacionarse el poder de las armas que representan las Fuerzas Armadas con el poder de la democracia, el poder de la mayoría que representan las autoridades electas, me parece que es un muy buen ejemplo. El profesor Bacon ha planteado una serie de visiones críticas que él tiene, y me parece muy legítima, respecto al propio ordenamiento estadounidense sobre esta materia, pero más allá de las críticas que uno puede tener, si uno ve la historia de los Estados Unidos, la historia independiente de los Estados Unidos por ya 200 y tantos años, lo cierto es que la relación que existe al interior del aparataje gubernamental de los Estados Unidos entre sus Fuerzas Armadas y su poder democrático es un caso de ejemplo. En los países hispanoamericanos, para qué decir, los golpes de Estado son, no sé si pan de cada día, pero pan de cada 50 años al menos, en casi todos nuestros países. Nuestra propia historia de Chile está colmada desde el primer golpe de Carrera, el año 1811 en adelante. Y eso habla de alguna manera de una mala relación entre el poder de las armas y el poder democrático. En Estados Unidos jamás han tenido algo de ese tipo. Han tenido otras cosas, tuvieron su guerra civil, por supuesto, la guerra de la secesión, etc. Pero no han tenido algo de esa especie. Y por lo tanto también es importante que veamos cómo ellos han afrontado estos temas, porque de ahí podemos sacar, me parece, lecciones importantes. Decía en alguna parte el profesor Bacon que es importante ver cómo las Fuerzas Armadas se relacionan con la sociedad. Yo querría, desde este humilde rincón del mundo llamado Chile, hacerle una pequeña observación crítica. Las Fuerzas Armadas son parte de la sociedad. No es que tengan que relacionarse con la sociedad como algo distinto. Son parte de la sociedad porque, bueno, son gente chilena igual que cualquiera, o son gente estadounidense como igual que cualquiera, pero además su familia, sus viven en la misma ciudad, es decir, no son un ente aparte, son parte íntegra, lo que no quiere decir que no haya que buscar las muy buenas maneras para controlar que quienes tienen el monopolio del uso de la fuerza, efectivamente sean, ya nuestra Constitución dice que son una fuerza obediente, desde luego, pero más que la palabra obediencia querría decir receptivos a la voluntad del poder político. Y esto tiene mucho que ver con uno de los puntos que me parece más destacados de la exposición del profesor Bacon, que es con esto que él dice la obligación de decir la verdad, o la obligación de advertir al bando político, a las autoridades políticas, hasta qué punto las fuerzas militares pueden actuar o no pueden actuar con una relativa perspectiva de éxito. Desde este punto de vista, a mí me parece que, más allá de los ejemplos que él dio, yo no conozco el sistema norteamericano por dentro, he tenido la oportunidad en mi muy tierna juventud de trabajar con una cierta cercanía con las Fuerzas Armadas norteamericanas, pero no conozco el sistema por dentro tan bien como él lo conoce, sin duda alguna. Pero yo tengo la impresión que más allá de que no exista esa obligación constitucional, quizás de los generales de manifestarle al poder político tal o cual cosa, o más allá de que el ejemplo que él daba de este general que se arrepentía no haber dicho al mando político en su momento que la guerra no era posible de ganar, yo no sé, estoy pensando viendo instituciones como el Pentágono, viendo cómo funciona el Departamento de Defensa norteamericano, visto al menos desde afuera, repito, no conozco el inside, pero visto al menos desde afuera, a mí me parece que ahí hay unos canales de comunicación bastante más abiertos que los que creo que tenemos en Chile. Yo sí he trabajado en nuestro Ministerio de Defensa, sé cómo funcionan nuestras fuerzas militares, y yo creo que aquí, por la desconfianza, mucho tiene que ver esto con el golpe de Estado, la dictadura y todo eso, no cabe ninguna duda. Pero yo no sé si antes era muy distinto tampoco. Y tiendo a pensar que no. Y de hecho, las quejas que existían de los propios militares durante mediados del siglo XX, respecto a la no consideración por parte del poder político, me dan a entender que esto no tiene que ver con resabios de la dictadura, sino que esto tiene que ver de alguna manera con, y vuelvo a mi primera frase, con que en Chile todavía no logramos tener el tono de la conversación adecuada entre el estamento militar y el poder político. ¿Cómo se crea esa no la obligación legal, uno puede poner en la Constitución lo que quiera, puede poner en la ley lo que quiere, papel aguanta cualquier cosa. ¿Cómo se crea en la mente de los mandos militares la conciencia de que deben tener una lealtad hacia el poder democrático tal que le signifique advertirle respetuosamente, por supuesto, esto todo dentro de un margen de respeto, por escrito, oficio, en 3 copias, timbrado, todo lo que quiera, pero advertirle a tiempo a las autoridades políticas que lo están haciendo mal, o que hay un peligro, pero esto también requiere reeducar a nuestras autoridades políticas, de tal manera que las autoridades políticas entiendan que cuando el general les dice, mire, este es el punto, recuerdo, el actual comandante en jefe del ejército, cuando invitada del estallido social, dando una declaración que yo creo que después estuvo muy preocupada, porque yo creo que se le salió un poco de improviso. Yo no estoy en guerra con nadie. Eso, de alguna manera, decantó el proceso o las posibilidades de eventual enfrentamiento. Esto fue el día 19 de octubre, al par de días después. Y eso puso unos paños fríos, muy fuertes, que temperaron en forma importante el pensamiento que la moneda, el poder político, tenía respecto a cómo enfrentar la revuelta social. Cómo crear canales para que, idealmente, eso no lo hubiera dicho por la prensa, sino que se lo hubiera dicho en vivo y en directo al presidente de la República, le hubiera dicho al presidente, esto es un problema distinto, por supuesto que tenemos que controlar el orden, pero aquí hay que caminar por otras líneas, diremos. ¿Cómo generar esos grados de confianza entre el mundo militar y el mundo civil? Cosa que ni los civiles entiendan que los militares no son sus enemigos, sino que son sus primos hermanos, sus tíos, sus algo. Si todos aquí, más temprano que tarde, llegamos a decir, no, si yo conozco a alguien porque un primo mío es casado con... No son gente de otro planeta, pero ¿cómo logramos de alguna manera imbrincar? Y los militares entienden cuál es su rol, y me gustó mucho como el título de esta ponencia, cuál es el rol de los militares en un sistema democrático y cuál es el rol de las autoridades democráticas respecto al poder militar. Quiero agradecer finalmente, o una vez más, al profesor Tim Bacon por su conferencia, me parece que es muy inspiradora. Ciertamente las realidades geopolíticas de Chile y Estados Unidos son muy distintas. El empleo de la fuerza militar en una superpotencia como es Estados Unidos no tiene mucho que ver con el empleo de la fuerza militar en un país medio como Chile, pero me parece que en estos momentos constituyentes que vivimos. Me parece que es importante poder conversar estas cosas, ver experiencias distintas a la de uno y intentar sacar lecciones de aquello. Así que, Tim, nuevamente, muchísimas gracias. Y por supuesto a todos los alumnos que han asistido, muchas gracias. Y nada, invitarlos a seguir pensando en estos temas. Muchas gracias, María.
Muchísimas gracias, director, profesor Luis Valentín Ferrada. Y ahora voy a abrir la posibilidad de que podamos tener un breve diálogo con ambos profesores. Entonces vamos a dar la oportunidad de que quien quiera hacer, por supuesto, alguna pregunta o algún comentario de las exposiciones. Ahora, hasta 5 intervenciones cortitas, por favor, hasta 5 voy a dar la palabra y voy a ir pasando junto a ustedes el micrófono. ¿A quién le gustaría comentar o hacer alguna pregunta, tanto de la conferencia como director profesor Ramón Huidobro, director del Departamento de Derecho Público? Es un honor que nos esté acompañando esta mañana. Por favor, adelante.
Muchas gracias. Quería agradecer al profesor Tim Bacon por la excelente exposición y al profesor Ferrada, magnífico comentario. Yo creo que esto es lo que hace falta en Chile, conversar sobre estos temas. Yo creo que hace 100 años que no se conversa. Ese es uno de los primeros problemas que tenemos en Chile. Este tema no se habla. O sea, se norma, se regula, y hemos sido el sistema normativo general al cual nos acercamos a todo lo que es administración del Estado civil y le damos el mismo tratamiento a lo militar sin considerarlo como una especialidad, o regulaciones especiales que se apartan completamente de lo civil y lo constituyen en un grupo separado. Justamente estaba revisando, porque el profesor Tim Bacon hablaba del proyecto constitucional que fue rechazado, pero yo acá tengo las normas de la comisión de expertos que van a ser propuestas y que ya fueron aprobadas y que van a iniciar el proceso constituyente nuevo. Y otra vez entramos a normas excluyentes de sistemas separados en los cuales no tienen derecho a sindicación, no tienen derecho a huelga. Ya, yo no digo que los militares puedan tener eso. Lo que pasa cuando uno ve el sistema comparado es la discusión de cómo entender esto dentro del sistema constitucional y dentro del sistema de derechos humanos. Eso es lo más trascendente para mí. Por ejemplo, en el modelo alemán, usted tiene un ciudadano soldado. El ciudadano tiene los mismos derechos que tiene, hay derecho de asociación, libertad de expresión, con límites por la función, pero es otro modelo. Entonces, la gran discusión que en Chile falta es qué fuerzas armadas queremos, qué sistema de defensa queremos y qué podemos hacer con los recursos que tenemos, que son también un tema que ha planteado el profesor Ferrada, porque nosotros no tenemos los recursos de Estados Unidos. Entonces, todas estas cosas han ido de a poco decantándose. Por ejemplo, era impresentable que las Fuerzas Armadas tuvieran un presupuesto independiente y autofinanciado sin una definición dentro del presupuesto general de la nación. O sea, eso se terminó. Pero ¿cuántos años costó? Después que el tema de la regulación del uso de la fuerza esté siendo discutida y el proyecto de ley va ahora, siendo que esto tendría que haberse regulado hace muchos años. Entonces, estamos regulando nuestro sistema ahora y frente a ciertos eventos. La ley de infraestructura crítica. También, por ejemplo, voy a recordar una intervención del comandante en jefe en el Congreso, en el cual después se criticó mucho de que por qué había opinado que esto alejaría de las funciones esenciales a las Fuerzas Armadas. Bueno, porque la decisión de cuáles son las funciones de las Fuerzas Armadas en Chile todavía no se discute. Entonces, al final de cuentas, esta discusión pendiente no nos permite definir las esencias del sistema y volvemos en los artículos 24 o 26 del nuevo proyecto a repetir normas que ya venían de sistemas anteriores sin hacer la discusión esencial, dejando toda la problemática al legislador después. Bueno, esperemos que el legislador esta vez sí haga la discusión en sociedad. Ahora, respecto de este rol dentro del sistema general, algunas sociedades ya han hecho esta discusión. Y yo le comentaba al profesor Bacon el caso de la sociedad española, que lo empezó a hacer en el 85 y lo terminó en el 2009 con la Ley de Derechos Fundamentales del Militar y de la Guardia Civil. entonces inserta al soldado dentro de la sociedad con unas características especiales, pero en relación a su función, y no deja ser distinto del resto de la sociedad. ¿Por qué digo esto? Porque en Chile todavía esto no se entiende. Tanto es así que el año pasado, 2022, a finales del año, si una moción parlamentaria quiere una reforma constitucional sobre incluir el respeto a los derechos humanos de los militares y policías. O sea, por no entender que tienen derechos humanos por el hecho de ser personas. O sea, no es el tema. Entonces, yo creo que ahí hay un tema muy pendiente en nuestra sociedad. Ahora, me impresionó lo que contaba el profesor Bacon de esto de sociedad separada que yo veo dentro del sistema militar norteamericano, que es mucho más profundo que lo que tenemos acá en Chile. Y nuevamente agradecer al Departamento de Derecho Internacional, profesor Amor, la excelente conferencia que nos han dado.
Muchas gracias, profesor Huidobro, por su excelente intervención. ¿Alguien más quiere? Sí, por favor. María Gabriela, adelante, pues.
Professor, thank you very much for such an amazing presentation. Now I have a question because you posted a very interesting question at the very end when you question, or you open the question, I would say, should the military have a separate legal system or not? Now, I do remember in the States the huge drama, for example, with the sexual scandals within the military. And the big question was, this should be actually be prosecuted as a normal civilian, or this should be a separate justice? I will leave the question to you. What's your opinion? What's your position in terms of this specific question? Should be civil, should be separate? What do you think should be the best?
As you like, Professor Moran, what it,
Then you can answer her and a professor, and then we continue with the rest of the questions.
thank you for those comments. Very enlightening. And thank you for the question. My view is that the military should not have a separate legal system. The ability of the military to have a separate legal system means essentially that it can create a penal system with which to control all the soldiers in the military. Some people might think of that as a good idea, and I suppose there's some historical precedence for it. In centuries past, it was difficult for armies that were spread out through the world to bring soldiers back to their countries to be prosecuted for crimes. That's not difficult anymore. The most prominent US prosecutions of soldiers have occurred in the United States, even though the alleged transactions, offenses, were committed in other countries. Let me give you one example that I think is somewhat illuminating to me as to my conclusion that the military system should not have a separate legal system. Just imagine if a police force could have a separate legal system. In the United States, as you may know, there is in many of the cities a high homicide rate, but the police officers who engage in many violent interactions with people inside the cities do not get prosecuted if they're charged with crimes by individual police prosecutors, the way military officers are under military prosecutors in the military system. What has happened, and what has been my big concern, is that the military establishment has decided not to speak. And here's how it works. And I'll just conclude with one short example. The United States Army, for example, has a process where it has the top 7 Army values. The number 1 value is loyalty. And then there are 7 other values: selfless service, honor, integrity, never leave a fallen soldier behind. But it also has the statute, and this is a military penal statute that says a soldier cannot engage in insubordination or disrespect. I agree with that. Nobody likes insubordination or disrespect, but there's another provision in that same statute that says to you, now imagine if this were you, not just that you were a soldier in any army, but if it were you in any instance, such as in law school or any kind of civic endeavor, that you were subject to this provision. And it says, if you were allegedly insubordinate or disrespectful, the truth is no defense. And I'm quoting that. That's not my paraphrase. The truth is no defense. Imagine what it would be like if someone who's higher in rank than you could say, you're disrespectful or you're insubordinate. And that in itself could be a crime. And you would say, I'm not insubordinate. I'm not disrespectful. All I've done is to say that I don't believe the war should be fought, or I don't believe that we can take that hill, or I don't believe the army should be operating in this way. And even if you're correct, even if 100% of the people in Chile agree with you, you're 100% correct. Because you said it disrespectfully, if you were an officer or soldier in the army, you can be prosecuted. That's the result in the United States military. The truth is no defense. And that, to that very apt question, is why I've concluded that's one reason why the military should not have a separate legal system.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your answer. And who else would like to make a comment or would like to ask something else to professors? ¿Alguien más quiere hacer alguna pregunta? Todavía tenemos para 2 o 3 preguntas o comentarios más. Sí. Adelante, Gabriel, por favor.
Good afternoon, Professor. Thank you for your conference. My question would be quite concrete one. What do you think of military leaders or such as, for example, military leaders in the US who entered active politics? The case of Eisenhower, who was a NATO commander, then president of the United States, other that attempted to follow a political career of the army as MacArthur, Wesley Clark, Colin Powell. How do you relate this involvement of US military leaders in democracy and active politics?
I would give an answer, and then I would ask for Professor Ferrada's comment also to see whether his perspective varies from mine. And I'm not sure that it does, but my belief is that military officers should have no involvement in politics. And it's acceptable that they're prohibited from running for political offices. As a side note, civilian federal employees are not permitted to run for political offices either. So there's a distancing of politics from government service, at least on the federal level. In terms of should they be allowed to run for political office after they've been military officers, I believe they should be, because they have vast experience and they have many great accomplishments. And I certainly wouldn't want a nation not to have the benefit of their service and accomplishments. One issue that does come up is after they get out of the military, do they have the opportunity to abuse their positions because they might know people inside the military? That's a possibility. Nonetheless, there could be laws passed that deal with that, but I believe they should have the opportunity to run for political office.
Professor Ferrada, please.
Sí, muchísimas gracias. Yo creo que es una pregunta muy compleja que tiene sus matices. Sin embargo, desde la perspectiva que personalmente considero, por supuesto, que la gente que está en las Fuerzas Armadas son ciudadanos exactamente igual que el resto. El punto no es una prohibición absoluta, y recojo lo que decía el profesor Bacon en parte, sino que pensar cómo pueden prestar un mejor servicio a los intereses nacionales. Y desde este punto de vista, por supuesto, que alguien que está en servicio activo debiera tener, o tiene de hecho, y debiera seguir teniendo bajo cualquier concepto, una prohibición absoluta de participar en temas políticos, diremos. Pero, insisto, pero esto no es nuevo. Es decir, en la historia de Chile, en el Chile reciente, el primero que llevó militares activos al gobierno fue el presidente Allende. Y son cosas que cada tanto se olvidan, diremos. Entonces, por supuesto que esa prohibición debiera ser absoluta para quienes están en servicio activo. Y seguramente, como hay acuerdos comerciales en el sentido cuando la gente vende una empresa y no puede poner una empresa al mismo tiempo durante una cierta cantidad de años, aquí debiera existir una regla parecida en el sentido que la gente que ha servido, sobre todo cargos de responsabilidad en la Fuerza Armada, debiera tener una prohibición temporal, diríamos 5 años, después de haberse retirado antes de incursionar en carreras políticas. Porque tampoco la estética y la ética a veces se juntan. No sé si es poco estético o poco ético, pero tampoco es, me parece que tampoco se ve bien que alguien que está cumpliendo su cargo como, estoy pensando en alguien que además que le tengo mucho aprecio, pero como comandante en jefe, entrega el cargo y en los 3 días asume un puesto en el gobierno. Tampoco me parece estético, al menos correcto. Entonces, yo creo que debiera haber un lapso de tiempo, pero sin duda alguna, el Estado de Chile ha invertido muchos, eventualmente miles millones de dólares en preparar a un oficial que llega a ser general en alguna fuerza armada para después despreciarlo. Termino con un cuento corto, pero que ilustra muy bien esto. Ustedes saben que los marinos, en el uniforme de los marinos con corbata negra. Entonces los marinos tienen una tradición que nunca recontratan a un marino en retiro hasta que no haya pasado un buen tiempo vistiendo corbata de colores. Lo que quiere decir que alguien que está en la Armada y pasa a retiro, pues bien, tendrá que trabajar un buen tiempo en el mundo civil y solo cuando ha vestido un buen tiempo corbata de colores, ahí la Armada está dispuesta a recontratarlo. Me parece que esto que suena como anecdótico, diremos, refleja de alguna manera una comprensión que me parece que es importante, y es separar la función militar y el poder que ella entrega con la función que pueda pasar a cumplir una vez que ingresa a la administración civil del Estado.
Bien, pues vamos a tomar una última. Joao quiere también decir una acá. Muy bien, adelante pues.
Thank you so much, Professor Tim and Professor Luis. This is such a wonderful subject, and I was wondering if you could draw upon your insight that the military should not have a separate legal system. Separate legal systems are not desirable. So I'd like to bring a little bit of context to this insight. Like, so when you have context wherein there is like a past dictatorship, and this sort of separate legal system had played a role, was applied to the transition process, like the Chilean case. And this created the conditions for such a disempowered constituency and the citizenship, which upon which there was a constitution was imposed on the citizenship. So you have a constitution imposed from above without the consent of this citizenship, and this sort of rule of separate legal system played a huge role in this process, right? So that could be important, I know. Yeah, you know, this is important for reconciliation between former enemies. We have a lot of reasons for this rule, I know, but I would like to ask you, do you think during a constitution making process, should we try to rule past injustices which were brought about this separate system, like in order to imagine a new constitutional future, a new constitutional identity, a more conciliatory one? Do you think like Chileans could rethink this conciliatory, this transition process, or rule backwards, abolishing this system backwards? I don't know if I made myself clear. Thank you.
Thank you, Joao. Sorry, I just want to say if we can answer this last question, and both of you make also answering the question, make final remarks, and then we can close the conference, because then it's ringing and the students have another lesson. So we will finish with this question and with the final 2 remarks. Thank you very much, Professor.
Should I go first?
Please,
And then
you first,
finish?
and then Professor Ferrara, and then we.
I appreciate that sensitive political question. The United States struggles with that issue also. I think it's very difficult to go back in time and enact reparations. It's for every country to determine, of course. South Africa has done it one way. Rwanda has done it another way. West Germany with East Germany has done it another way. I can't say that any one way is better than another. It's really has to be, I believe, based on a society and a culture. The United States is even considering it now, the concept of reparations for Black Americans whose ancestors were enslaved. And I don't believe the US Constitution ultimately would permit reparations for people on the basis of race for things that happened in the past. Nonetheless, I believe that's probably a formal answer to your question. Practically, it would be very difficult, but also theoretically, in providing benefits to people now for what happened in the past, we would be holding responsible people in the present who did not have relatives who were mistreated in the past, responsible for what their relatives had done in the past. My initial impression is that kind of collective responsibility is very difficult to apply theoretically and practically. I understand the issues with the dictatorship and prior to the dictatorship and colonialism in Chile. United States has some of those same issues. People sometimes forget that colonialism established the United States, and we have indigenous people there who suffer greatly and continue to suffer greatly because of what happened to their ancestors 200 and 300 years ago. I don't have a satisfactory answer for your question, but I know I can see, because of some of my understanding about Germany, Rwanda, and South Africa, that it is ultimately dependent on the culture and the society in which one lives. There is no best answer. In the United States, I don't believe it will be possible because of the constitutional protections and guarantees of equal protection. Nobody can be favored on the basis of race or birth or national origin. It might be different in Chile, it might be a different choice that you'll make, but formally I can say that I don't think it will be possible in the United States. Whether that's right or wrong, culturally and socially, is probably a little bit beyond my expertise as a legal scholar.
Muchísimas gracias. No, yo creo que respecto a la pregunta me parece que es suficiente. Yo simplemente quería dar unas palabras finales. Agradecer al profesor Tim Bacon por estar aquí con nosotros esta mañana. Agradecer a Fulbright, que ha hecho posible que viniera a Chile, y muy en particular a la profesora Ana María Moure, que ha organizado esta oportunidad, esta estancia del profesor Bacon aquí en Chile. Y creo, retomando las palabras del señor director, a puertas de asumir del Departamento de Derecho Público, el profesor Ramón Huidobro, yo creo que estas son conversaciones que en Chile en general no tenemos, y en esta facultad menos. Pero son temas sobre los cuales no hay que tenerle miedo, diríamos. Hay que conversar porque de alguna manera la relación de quienes ostentan el poder de las armas con quienes ostentan el poder democrático es esencial, la buena relación es esencial para que nuestra sociedad progrese. Así que felicitar nuevamente la iniciativa y muchísimas gracias a todos ustedes.
Muchas gracias a todos por venir, pues los esperamos en los próximos eventos que haga el Departamento de Derecho Internacional de nuestra facultad. Muchas gracias, hasta luego.
Por favor.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Forgive us for anything that was not
It was
very
fantastic. It was great.
Professor Bacon,
Yes.
may I ask you some questions
Yes,
about,
of course.
well, currently we're having an immigration problem, an immigration crisis.
Yes.
Yes.